Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. One area of education that is becoming more popular, and I think for various reasons, is this whole concept around makerspaces. Because I can tell you, as a consultant going into schools, even though I'm seeing more student engagement across the board, I still see top-down, very rote, passive learning that's going on in classrooms where teachers are lecturing and students are taking notes. And I would never say that that shouldn't be a part of learning, because obviously sometimes students do need to just have the basic facts. But there's so much more we could be doing to be engaging our students in learning. One of those ways is to develop makerspaces. So because of this, I'm really excited to have as my next guest, Matt Zigler, who is currently a teacher at the Bullis School. He also runs their makerspace lab. He's a professional artist, and kudos to him. He is the author of the brand new book, Make, 3 Modes of Making, Designing Purposeful Projects to Teach Maker Skills. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Matt, getting right into things, how did makerspaces become an area of interest for you within the field of education?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little unexpected. I was an art teacher for about 15 years. And then I got into some administrative work. I was a dean of students at a small private school in North Carolina, and was getting a little bit burnt out with that, and wanted to get some creativity back into my job. And luckily, I had a great head of school who was interested in developing a makerspace at that school, and came to me and said, "Is this something that you'd be interested in?" And I thought about it a lot because I had seen makerspaces at some schools, and they were full of technology, and they were often empty of students, and that seemed very depressing to me. And I felt like if I was going to run a makerspace, it had to be something that was active, that was accessible to everybody, that every student in the school would benefit from, not just the students that had already sort of self-selected as techies or hackers or whatever it is they wanted to call themselves. So we came up with a plan. I did a lot of thinking. I did some professional development to come up with some ideas, and pitched an idea to the school, and they thought it was great. And the central idea of it is that the makerspace needs to function more like a library than like a science lab. It has to be a space that is a resource for your English teachers and your art teachers and your history teachers as much as for your engineering and robotics teachers, so that the space itself is a tool for kids to be able to learn content. And I think that really worked out well at that school, and allowed me to pitch that idea to Bullis, where I work currently, which was building a huge new makerspace and fab lab, and had way more space and tools than I had ever believed possible. But they were really interested in this idea of a space that was accessible to every student in the school, not just the technology focused kids.
I love that. And just to backtrack for a moment, although I suppose many people listening to this podcast will know what a makerspace is, could you tell us a little bit more about the ins and outs of what a makerspace is? And then maybe if you could describe what the makerspace looks like at the Bullis School.
Yeah, absolutely. So A makerspace can be it can be a shelf in the corner of a room with some tools and materials on it, or it could be a full-fledged lab like we have at Bullis. It is really the idea of tools and materials that are available for making projects, making hands-on projects. Oftentimes, those tools have a technological component. A lot of our tools are run by computers. You know, the thing that everybody thinks about with makerspaces are 3D printers, but there's lots of other what we call digital fabrication tools, basically tools that are robots that you can design objects and then the machine will make it for you with certain input from you as the designer. But there's also, you know, lots of cardboard cutting tools, lots of glue, lots of hot glue guns. They could be wood or whatever. And in reality, each school's makerspace is going to be a little bit different depending on the interests and the types of making that the kids and the teachers at that school want. And certainly ours has evolved. The Bit Lab, it's called the Bullis Innovation and Technology Lab, is two fairly large classrooms. One side is set up with the ability to have a class. So we teach robotics, we teach engineering, we actually have a new class, trimester class called Fashion Technology, which I'm really excited about. And so it's set up as a classroom space, but there are also other tools around. So there are 3D printers in the back. There are robotics parts, you know, stashed on the shelves, and then we also have sewing machines, and we have popsicle sticks and you know, googly eyes. You got to have some of those. So that's the one space, and then when you go into the back, it basically looks like, you know, an old school shop class. It's got all the woodworking and metalworking tools, but it has some you know, digital fabrication tools as well. So we have laser cutters and we have a CNC machine, which is like a giant laser cutter, and we have welding, you know. So it's really sort of, if you can come up with an idea and we have the time to make it, then we can probably figure out a way to make it a physical object.
Nice. And so you were saying before, Matt, that makerspaces is not just for the techies, that you can have makerspaces and use makerspaces for ELA and social studies and science, right? And so it's not just for those techies, but really you could be using makerspaces in all of your content areas. So why then? Why should we use makerspaces across all disciplines?
I think there's a lot of reasons, but the main one for me comes down to creativity. You know, I think that when one of the in the book I talk about this IBM survey that they did with CEOs of major companies around the world, and this was 10 years ago. They identified that the most important leadership quality that they thought would be emerging would be creativity, both the ability to be a creative leader as well as to allow and inspire creativity in the employees within their business. And then the word innovation continues to pop up, you know, year after year in their reports. And there's also research. There's a Gallup poll that talks about how when teachers introduce creativity in their classroom, their students actually retain information better. They are better critical thinkers. They perform better on standardized tests because they actually understand the content, because they're not just memorizing it, they're actually applying their knowledge and their understanding and having to demonstrate it in a tangible way. So I think it largely boils down to creativity, and I think, you know, I might be a little biased coming from the art teacher realm, but it is, I think, a thing that we need to focus more on in schools, because we are moving out of the world, you know, whether it's manufacturing or, you know, robots or AI, that the sort of good jobs and the good career paths that we want our kids to have are going to require kids to be able to think creative and be creative problem solvers. So I think that's where, when a makerspace is doing its best, it's helping push the idea that creativity is something that can be applied in English, in history, in math, in science. It's not just something that happens in the art studio. And so that's what makerspaces, I think, have the potential to do for a lot of students.
Definitely. And I think the other thing too that is exciting about makerspaces is that it shows us as educators that there are other ways to also assess students. We don't just have to give paper and pencil tests. To your point, you really have to understand the underpinning concepts in order to create something new from that, right? That's
Yeah.
really what we're talking about when we're talking about cognitive engagement and active learning as opposed to passive learning. So I'm excited about the makerspace movement, even from the perspective that it is providing students with multiple ways to show that they understand the concepts, that
Right.
not all of our students learn best through paper and pencil, that there
Yep.
are indeed other ways to show mastery.
Yeah, and time after time, I have teachers who maybe have never done a hands-on project related to their content. And they bring their kids in, and we do something, and they will almost always say to me, so and so is never this engaged in class. So and so it became a leader. Like, how did that happen? They're always quiet in the back of the room. And I said, well, this is their environment. This is what they want to be doing. And listening to lectures, or even, having good classroom discussion, is not for everybody. And so this gives those students who maybe are bored or just are not able to follow the verbal part of that conversation some way to demonstrate that they actually know what they're talking about, and they can learn this content and really demonstrate their understanding.
So what would you say, Matt, looking at the experience of your Makerspace Lab, what have been some of the most exciting projects you've seen teachers create with their students? And would you mind, if you can, share an example or two from ELA, from social studies, from math, just to give our listeners an idea of just how broadly you could use makerspaces in learning?
Absolutely. So probably one of the most interesting projects, just because it's a project that evolves year after year, is we have a African American Studies class in our history department. And it was a new class when I started at Bullis 7 years ago. And the teacher approached me and said, there's these monuments that are being put up about about Jim Crow and about the racism that was prevalent during those times, and still is prevalent today. And we want to do a project about that. And so the students would actually do their research. They would come having already looked into some aspect of Jim Crow, some person, some event, and then they would, as a group, decide on a project to work on. And the group process was probably one of the most amazing, because they had to come to some consensus. And the amazing thing is that each year the projects would be different, and they would be a reflection of that group of students. And so one year we had students that built these little wooden boxes that had words on the cover that they said were the lie, right? So that, ignorant, or incapable, or whatever, things that were told about African Americans. And then you would open them up, and the true story would be inside. They called them like hidden gems. And there would be little artifacts that they had made that told the story of the first Black congressman, or the first woman to graduate with a 4-year college degree, Black, African American woman to graduate. And so it was this beautiful little image. And then the next year they made a board game that talked about how impossible it was to be alive during that time. It was about struggle. And so it was amazing that with the same amount, with the same content, with the same research, they came up with completely different responses that told really important parts of the story, but in the way that they felt was most appropriate. So that's, history projects often have a lot of symbolism in them. A lot of board games are actually really fun, because there's systems that students have to figure out how that time period maps to rules, and how you would get that experience across to a game player. With math, we've got projects from a lot of geometry obviously can be taught with physical objects, building objects. So giving students a particular size that they can work in, and then they have to design something that can hold a whole bunch of little objects in some way, like an organizer, and sometimes you can give them the real objects, like design here's a drawer, and now you got to get all your silverware in there, and how would you design the perfect organizer and figure out all the dimensions of all these parts, so it becomes a much more tangible thing, and they can see geometry in the real world. I've also done calculus. We did differential equations looking at predator-prey relationships using some coding and some 3D modeling, and then showing how that actually works in the real world. So, that just sometimes it's hard to figure out how calculus actually applies to the real world. At least it was for me as a student. That was not my strong suit. But was kind of fun because they could make recommendations. This talked about, wolves and moose, and one of the populations was crashing, and what could you do? Could you add more wolves, or how would you model that to show that it actually worked? In a lot of our language classes do projects, and again, they tend to be directed towards a lot of symbolism, representational imagery. Our students have to do individual performance assessments, so they have to stand up and speak before the class. And so oftentimes they'll come and they'll make an object so that they can actually have something to point to. So if the object is talking about, their passions or their interests, they have symbols that help key them into what they're going to talk about, but also give them, it's almost like a note-taking way that they can hold it up in front and point to certain objects and designs and shapes and symbols that represent them, so that they can talk about it and feel more comfortable being able to talk about it without having to remember everything. So those are a few of the projects that we've done. Every year I probably get about 15 to 20 projects, and some of them are new each year and some of them are repeaters, and it's really fun to come up with new projects. I help the teachers design those things.
That's incredible. And there's so much to love about that. So when you were talking, I was thinking about the connections to writing, the connections to analysis that students need to do. I was thinking about the real world relevance that you were bringing in. I was even thinking about the cultural relevance, depending on, what the topic is and the students' individual backgrounds, right? So
Right.
there's so much to engage the students in that, even beyond creating a project itself. Like you said, it's talking and thinking about the symbolism. It's delving into a topic of interest. So there's no wonder, at least for me, why a student who might be less engaged by lecture, especially if they do like to be moving around and creating and doing, why they would gravitate towards a maker space, and how we get more teachers to realize the importance of letting go,
Yeah.
loosening those controls, if you will, and allowing a certain amount of productive chaos, if that makes sense. So I guess that even actually leads me into my next question, Matt, which is, if maker spaces are to succeed, what are the criteria or the conditions a school needs to have in place for a makerspace to work? And when they don't work, what are usually the reasons for that?
Yeah. So this is what I think. The tools that we have in our lab are very similar to a lot of other labs that are out there. I think what we have is a different system. I am very much of the mindset that, like I said, and I talk about this a lot in the book, that the makerspace has to be along the lines of a library. Your library has a librarian. It has a person who you don't schedule 80% of their time teaching classes and expect them to be able to do amazing things with students related to finding resources and doing, writing stories and doing research. You have to give them that kind of schedule that allows them to work with teachers, to design projects, to maintain the space. I mean, just the amount of time that I spend tweaking and fixing and working on the machines to keep them running, given how much use they get. is a big part of my job. And you can imagine that is like your librarian reshelving books and picking up the things that are left out and getting the space functional for the next group that comes in. So I think it's really important that, and like I said, I had seen maker spaces that looked amazing and there were no kids in them and there was no teachers, and there were sign up sheets. You could sign up to use the maker space. And what I realized is teachers have enough on their plate. You're not going to also learn how a 3D printer works. You're not going to also learn how a laser cutter works or how to code a microbit. You need somebody who will do that work for you so that you are focused on the content of your project, English teacher or math teacher or history teacher. And the librarian, the makerspace coordinator, is helping manage and facilitate the process. And I really think that that is the only way that it is really successful, is if administrators and teachers look at it as a library, which is a community resource. Nobody would ever think we need to get rid of the library. They might say we need to change how the library works, or we need more digital books or physical books or whatever, but they're never going to say we don't need a library. As much as they want the library, they would also say, hey, we got this library, let's kick out the librarian, or let's make the librarian an English teacher or whatever. You need to have that same mentality with your makerspace to make it work. Beyond that, I think that your makerspace coordinator needs to be somebody who has some creative experience. Coming from the art world, it was very easy for me to make a small leap to how to apply creativity to a wide array of subjects, because art is about all different types of subjects. I was just expanding the options of tools that I could use to do these projects. Whereas a lot of times teachers who are coming from the robotics and engineering side that are really into the technical details and aren't so good with the creative side, they may struggle a little bit. They may be good keeping the machines running, but designing that project might be a little bit more difficult for them. It can certainly be learned. And my book has some ways that I design projects. I use a method called backward design, which is very effective at focusing on just the content that you want the project to be about, and to make sure you're not putting lots of extraneous stuff in there. And I think, once you have all that in place, then you just need a level of exposure and trust. And, I think the teachers after 7 years, they understand that I'm not going to throw a lot of technical information and details at them. I'm going to try to handle that for them. And I'm going to try to make it as smooth a process for them, because for me, it's good for the kids to be exposed to the space and to how the space works, because some of them may never have thought of themselves as wanting to try something creative or technological. And they may then sign up for one of our trimester or year-long courses that actually takes place in there. So I don't need to teach the teachers how to 3D print. I'll run that part of it. After a few years, though, some of the teachers do learn it and they'll come in and run some of the projects themselves. So I think those are the three things. It's more the system that's in place to make the makerspace a community resource that is really feels accessible to everybody, rather than necessarily just the tools.
I really like how by dedicating a person to be the makerspace expert, it does free up the classroom teacher to, again, continue to focus on the content and not have to worry about how to learn that 3D printer. What are 1 to 3 simple ways teachers, if they don't have access to a full maker lab, can still be bringing in some of the concepts of maker spaces and still utilizing that within the body of their instruction?
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging to start a space from nothing. At the school I was at in North Carolina, I had a budget of $10,000 and I had 2 computer labs that were no longer computer labs, and they were small. And but I would put the creative thinking that the kids did at that school at just a high level as the creative thinking of the kids where I am now. The kids where I am now have a few more opportunities to sort of pull those projects into a further level of development. But I do think that it's more that mentality of letting the kids have some agency, letting them have some power, creating challenge-based activities that say, here, this is this is what we're trying to solve. Whether it is how do we build an object that represents the plot of this book, or what would a game that allows us to understand how the water cycle works in the real world, and then let the kids go at it from there. And cardboard is your friend, and it's got these great cardboard cutters called canary cutters that you can cut cardboard very easily without worrying about fingers, no matter what age they are. And then a lot of glue and a lot of tape, if that's where you're at, if you're just doing it in your classroom, and allowing them to be very creative with it and build something. And then you can take it a step further. There's a lot of free online resources, particularly in the 3D modeling realm. Tinkercad.com is a program that's made by Autodesk. It's essentially, it's got a lot of tutorials, but when you get right down to it, it's sort of building complex objects out of simple objects. You put a cube and a sphere and a cylinder together, and you merge them, and you have created a 3D model. And it's not far from that to actually getting a 3D printer, which, if somebody is able to maintain it and run it on your campus, 3D printers are a few $100s now. They're not thousands of dollars like they used to be. And you can have that opportunity to turn those 3D models that the kids are making into physical objects. It is a little bit of that uncomfortable moment of saying, okay, I've sort of said, this is our goal. Now I'm going to step back and I'm going to let you, with discussion with me, I'm still here. I'm a part of the team. I'm a very important part of the team, but I'm not, the leader of the team necessarily. Let's see what we can come up with. And I think teachers who do that are generally amazed at how engaged the kids are, how much they want to do really good work, and some of the ideas that they come up with.
When you were talking about how to do projects in ELA, in social studies, that reminded me really of your subtitle and your subsections of your book. So you talk about maker projects being in the realm of imitation, modification, and innovation. Could you just describe what those are, what the difference is amongst those?
Yeah, so I structure my courses around this. And I think about it in terms of, in math, we have to sort of point to different types of math and call it certain things, whether it's algebra or geometry or calculus. And it helps us identify the skills that we need to actually do those different types of math. And creativity is a tricky thing. I can say we need to get more creativity into schools, but if I didn't give suggestions on how to do that, I think it would be kind of a waste of a book. So for me, I've kind of drawn some lines between different types of making. And in the one hand, what everybody's probably used to is what I call imitation. You are following a tutorial, you're using a video, you're maybe, if you think about Lego, right, you're following the instructions in the Lego kit step by step to try to build that object. And a lot of people discount that as meaningful making, but I try to make the case that I think it's really important. It's how we learn skills. It's how we, those kids who are going to learn how to code a microbit, they're going to follow a tutorial. They're going to move the blocks in the code to where they tell them to do it. And through that process, they're going to get a feel for how this works. But that's obviously not the end goal. We don't want to stop there. We want to have a little bit more control over the world. So the next phase that I work with them is called modification, where you are taking things that exist and you're personalizing them, you're improving them, you're changing them in some way. Maybe you're taking something that is meant for one thing and you're applying it to something else in a new way. And that is the beginning of sort of taking the world as it is and turning it into the world as we want it to be. And it's really challenging because if you're building something and it needs to fit in a particular space, well, you're going to have to measure, you're going to have to actually know how big it needs to be. And so you can't just make stuff up. So we talk a lot about constraints and about understanding materials. Some materials will work well for certain things and some materials won't, or certain tools will do well for some things and some tools won't. And so in some of the projects, like a science project, maybe where they're building a scientific instrument. There's lots of projects out there where you can build instruments where kids can actually measure and do science in the world. That's going to be an imitation project. They're following the set of instructions because it has to do the thing that the original did, and theirs should work the way that the original did. But there comes a point when maybe you want to change that that scientific instrument a little bit. You want to make it bigger than the original, or you want to make it do a different function than the original. That's where modification comes in. Then the last step, where I think a lot of people assume that all makerspace projects need to be, is this word innovation, which is almost as hard to define as creativity. But for me, it's the idea of going into new territory, of really sort of exploring and experimenting. And so modifying, maybe making small changes, small improvements, something that you feel relatively confident is going to work if you get the settings right or whatever. But when you're innovating, you are actually saying, I have an idea, something that I've never seen before, or is significantly different than anything that I've seen before, and I want to try to get it to work. And that becomes the scientific experimental process. You're actually having to try things, prototype, test, and see whether they work. When they fail, you try a different way, you figure out why they fail. And so you get into a lot of skills of evaluating and prototyping, and generating ideas in the first place is not easy for a lot of people. And so the important part is that you can't do just one of those things. You have to do all of them.
And I think well, not I think, I know you're exactly right. Where we do learn in different ways and we create, like you said, in different ways. And you do need those skills and that practice in learning something to become an expert at it. What is it they say? You have to fall off of a horse 8 times before you know how to ride a horse. You need that practice, you need that struggle, which you were also mentioning. And that productive struggle also gets at helping our students to develop social emotional skills
Yeah.
of adaptation, of grit, of perseverance, of, taking a problem situation and seeking solutions for that, and not just crumbling the first time something doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, it's very rare the project that students might do it in the makerspace that has to be right the first time. And it's much more common that I say it's not going to work the first time. Let's make our first really bad version so that we can get that out of the way and then start improving upon it. And I think, I absolutely see that there are students who they almost sometimes I have to explicitly give them permission to make a really bad thing. They are so trained to, this is a test and I have to do my best work on the test. And if I fail the test, or if the object that I make doesn't work, then I failed, and that's awful, and that can keep you from even starting in the first place. The end product is not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the process that students use to get there.
Matt, is there anything that we haven't talked about makerspaces that you think the listeners should know?
I just, maker spaces are fun. I think that kids really enjoy coming into our lab to do projects. I think they really get excited when they leave. I work at a school that's K through 12. Today I had seniors in right after I had kindergartners in, and the level of fun and enjoyment that they had being in there was pretty much the same. And so I think that if you're able to start pushing that idea of a makerspace in your school, or like I said, even some schools just have a little corner of the library with some tools that they can have kids start to use, and that's the beginning of it. I think whatever little step you can make towards having a hands-on creative space that allows kids the opportunity to make choices, to come up with ideas, and to fail at them, and then eventually succeed. I think it's really important, and I think it can change the experience of a lot of kids in education.
So, Matt, where can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, so the book is available. It's on Amazon. I have a website. It's mattzigler.com. Hopefully pretty easy to remember. And I have some of my artwork there. I also have some blog posts. I don't get to blog nearly as much as I want either, but interesting projects that I've worked with teachers, or some of the concepts that we talked about here are on that blog, and I try to keep that updated. And then also some more information about the book is on there. I'll tell you the one really exciting one. If you go to if you go to YouTube and you look up the We Stroll project,
Uh-huh.
WHEE Stroll, it's a wheelchair stroller adapter that students in my Making for Social Good class designed, and it got picked up on the local DC news, and then it got picked up on the national news. That students were quoted in the Washington Post, and CBS Evening News came out and interviewed a couple of the students about the project. But so that was obviously a very exciting thing, but it'll give you a little glimpse into some of the types of work that we do in the Bit Lab.
So Matt, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.